the retro-fascist hegemony of the Prosperity Party of Abiy Ahmed. The One Ethiopia, myth on myth of the nostalgia of Abyssinian settler colonial project. We examine the ideological architecture of the Prosperity Party, led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, framing it as a retro-fascist regime operating within a predatory Abyssinian settler colonial state. By analyzing the One Ethiopia, 𝐸𝐴𝐵𝐸 doctrine, this study argues that the administration utilizes assimilationist and homogenizing dogmas functionally equivalent to the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft and the final solution. Furthermore, this paper contextualizes the contemporary 𝐾𝐫𝐴ZE Ethiopian state, more precisely the creation of European Abyssinia Empire. Between 1868 and 1900, Menelik alone received from European leading powers Britain, France, Italy, and Russia 715,000 rifles, 50 million ammunition, military experts, mercenaries, and finance. As a result, after 4 centuries of relentless attempts of the Abyssinian warlords to conquer and occupy the south, they were always chased back by the Galana Tulama Oromo cavalry alone. It was the provision of European firearms and ammunition that enabled to conquer and colonize the entire south to Abyssinian core and establish one of the most backward predator-settler colonial European Abyssinian empire that contemporary trades with stolen name Ethiopia, translated from the word Kush by Greeks. Currently an estimated 130 million people, diverse indigenous nations have been incarcerated. The Abyssinian Empire and the settler colonial matrix. To understand the contemporary crisis in the Horn of Africa, one must deconstruct the foundational myth of Ethiopia on myth as an ancient, homogeneous, and unbroken Christian kingdom that only existed on pieces of paper or goat skin, and in the cocoons of settler colonialist, dishonest certificate holders, the worst burden of the people and the colonized and assimilated working horses. The masses of the population do not know the Alean meaningless Greek name. They have beautiful and meaningful ancestral names inherited from one to the next generation for time immemorial. Most of us heard the name Ethiopia in the settler colonial schools and propaganda. In critical geopolitical and sociological terms, Ethiopia is more accurately analyzed as an appropriated name of the predatory, Abyssinian-centric settler colonial empire originating from the northern highlands, 𝐊𝐴𝐵𝐿𝐴. The Abyssinian state, if one can at all call it, embarked on a violent, European-style imperial expansion, most decisively in the late 19th century, that began by the cruelest warlords. It began with Tuadros, 1855-1868, followed by 𝐿𝐴𝐿𝐲'𝐬, 1870-1889, and finally, Menelik, 1889-1913. In the mouths of the people, they were called half devil and half 𝐏𝐫𝐴ZE, reflecting their horrific subhuman acts such as mutilating hands, hanging them by the neck, and sending them back to their communities to shock others, mutilating the feet of men, the breasts of women, killing by hanging in the center of the market, and enjoying the spilling of human blood. This expansion increased 5 to 6 times the territorial size of 𝐏𝐵𝐴ZE proper, Amhar and Tigray Malni, of the empire, by conquering, subjugating, and incorporating vast indigenous populations, including the Oromo, Sidama, Walata, Afar, Somali, and numerous nations of the Gambella and Benishangul-Gumuz regions. Since the era of Menelik, today an estimated cumulative total of over 130 million people across generations have lived under the administrative, cultural, and military yoke of this centralized northern-dominated apparatus. Rather than a voluntary federation, this structure operates on extractive settler colonialism, land expropriation, cultural erasure, linguistic suppression, and economic marginalization of the colonized indigenous majorities. Within this historical continuum, the rise of the Prosperity Party under Abiy Ahmed represents not a democratic transition, but a retro-fascist resurgence determined to reimpose absolute Abyssinian hegemony through modern state violence. 2. One Ethiopia, 𝐸𝐴𝐵𝐸 as a totalitarian paradigm. Upon assuming power in 2018, Abiy Ahmed initially masked his agenda in the rhetoric of Medimur, synergy, and democratic reform, subsequently consolidating power into the Prosperity Party. Ideologically, the regime relies on the centralizing myth of one Ethiopia, an uncompromising, chauvinistic nationalism that demands the complete erasure of multinational federalism, ethnic autonomy, and indigenous rights. The one Ethiopia premise functions similarly to the Nazi concept of Gleichschaltung, coordination, and the Aryan supremacist ideal of the Volksgemeinschaft, people's community. Under this doctrine, pluralism is criminalized. The recognition of distinct nations, nationalities, and peoples, enshrined in the 1995 Constitution, is vilified as ethnic balkanization or treason. Cultural hegemony is mandated. Amharic Abyssinian cultural norms, historical narratives, and religious dominance are universalized as the baseline of true citizenship, reducing non-Abyssinian nations to second-class status. Dissent is eradicated. Opposition to central state overreach is met with totalizing state violence, mass incarceration, and extrajudicial executions. 3. The Abiy Ahmed administration and the analogy of the final solution. The trajectory of the Prosperity Party administration, particularly manifested in the genocidal war in Tigray, ongoing state-sponsored atrocities, and the persecution in Oromia, Benishangul-Gumuz, etc. IDs, demonstrates operational parallels to fascist statecraft and genocidal intent. Dehumanization and propaganda. Just as the Nazi regime utilized Joseph Goebbels' ministry to paint Jews and other minorities as existential parasites, Untermenschen, threatening the German body politic, the Abiy regime and its state-aligned media apparatus routinely deploy dehumanizing language. Tigrayans were labeled cancer, weeds, and daylight hyenas, while Oromos and other restive populations demanding self-determination are routinely cast as terrorists, narrow nationalists, or foreign agents. This rhetorical framing is a mandatory precursor to mass violence, desensitizing the dominant demographic to state-sanctioned atrocities. Total warfare and weaponized starvation. The relentless chronic untold war in Oromia under TPLF-EPDF tyrannical rule for soiled 28 years, worsened under the retro-fascist party called Prosperity led by Abiy. One of the ugly fascist criminal member of the party officially stated, "We must dry the ocean to kill fish," in parliamentary session with his master's Creole Amharic language. In his cocoon, the subject fish that turned to them sleepless is the gallant Oromo Liberation Army, OLA, that operates in Oromia. And the ocean refers to the great Oromo nation of the Horn of Africa that makes at least half of the population incarcerated in this prison house for about 2 centuries, that currently estimated to 130 million plus, according to the UN data. The War on Tigray People, 2020-2022. By scapegoating his masters for almost 3 decades, the TPLF served as a testing ground for the regime's ultimate method of subjugation. Total war combined with the weaponization of starvation, medical blockades, and systemic sexual violence. Estimates of excess deaths, ranging from hundreds of thousands to nearly 1 million, reflect a deliberate policy of attrition reminiscent of Nazi hunger plans, Der Hungerplan, implemented in Eastern Europe. See paramilitary radicalization and state terror. Mirroring the role of the Nazi Sturmabteilung, SA, and Schutzstaffel, SS, the Abiy regime relies on ethnic militias, such as the Fano extremists, alongside state security forces to carry out ethnic cleansing, land seizures, and massacres with total impunity. The state outsources violence to radical nationalist elements to reshape the demographic and political landscape of contested regions permanently. 4. Retro-fascism, nostalgia for imperial autocracy. The term retro-fascist aptly describes the Prosperity Party's ideological orientation, selective excavation of ancestral myth on myth to legitimize their contemporary eliminator policies. The hidden policy that states, "There are no Oromos and Oromia, Sidamas, Afars, other about 90 free ethno-nationals, but only one Ethiopia." the one Ethiopia of contemporary prosperity part is to move in a retrograde path to the 1931 feudal constitution of the empire. It is very important to underline one. It was known to the first constitution in written form by plagiarizing the combination of the Meiji Empire of Japan, 1868-1912, and the Orthodox Christian Tsarists Russia. Thus, one may easily get rid of the schizophrenia of 3,000 years of civilization, the hypocrisy, bit empty drum of myth a ballads louder, etc., to sail lies without having a constitution. 2. Most importantly advised by the European mentors, the name Abyssinia was replaced with Ethiopia. In this constitution of the empire, for the first time stated, Article 1, the territory of Ethiopia in its entirety is, from one end to the other, subject to the government of His Majesty the Emperor. All the natives of Ethiopia, subjects of the empire, form together the Ethiopian Empire. Settled colonial Nefenyas, armed fanatics and illiterate barefoot killing hordes, dogs of war-speak Amharic and third-hand translations of Byzantine Empire mythological version of Coptic Orthodox Christianity, a mythical theological political instrument, arrived in the 14th century and used as a rescue mission by Abyssinian warlords to seize power, as in the Roman Empire, but the Abyssinian perception and practice was called the vulgar version of it. They know nothing, have nothing in it then and now. It is just a tool like handing a loaded gun to one who have never seen it, and to tell him to pull trigger and to enjoy watching the result. The historical trajectories of Menelik and Haile Selassie complicate the binary narratives of African resistance to imperialism. While both monarchs successfully defended the geopolitical sovereignty of the Ethiopian state against European colonialism, their domestic policies enacted a form of internal colonialism upon peripheral populations. Menelik campaigns of conquest, utilization of captive labor, and reliance on the slave trade bear distressing structural and moral resemblances to the atrocities committed by King Leopold II in the Congo. Haile Selassie, operating in 20th century geopolitical landscape defined by international law and anti-slavery conventions, was forced to dismantle the legal architecture of slavery, yet he preserved the broader socioeconomic hierarchy established by his predecessor. Recognizing this complex history is essential for a holistic understanding of modern Ethiopian state building, one that acknowledges, unlike classical 20th century fascism, which sought to forge a futuristic industrial empire, Abiy Ahmed's fascism is inherently retrogressive. It looks backward with deep nostalgia to the autocratic, feudal era of Menelik and Haile Selassie, yearning for an idealized past of absolute monarchs, unquestioned imperial authority, and the subjugation of the periphery. Abiy's personal megalomania, coupled with theological syncretism and messianic rhetoric, mirrors the authoritarian personality cults of historical European dictators. He presents himself not merely as a political leader, but as an indispensable sovereign ordained to save the ancient empire from disintegration. This retro-fascist nostalgia weaponizes history, rewriting the brutal colonial conquests of the 19th century as acts of unification and heroism, while delegitimizing the historical trauma of the colonized nations. The imperial crisis and the 130 million ensnared. For well over a century, from the blood-soaked campaigns of Menelik to the drone strikes and mechanized ethnic cleansing authorized by Nobel Peace Laureate Abiy Ahmed, the Abyssinian settler colonial empire has maintained its cohesion through violence. An estimated 130 million souls across multiple generations have been caught within this coercive framework, denied genuine self-determination, human security, and cultural survival. Thank you for tuning in, sharing, and engaging with my content every single day. Your comments, feedback, and enthusiasm create a vibrant community that inspires us to keep growing, creating, and pushing boundaries.